Okay, well, thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you all for joining me on this rather lovely day in London. Um, this is the latest talk in the lockdown series on great Jewish cities, and I shall be talking about Baghdad. And I hope you are feeling up to a gentle meander through the streets of Baghdad. But it's also going to be a journey through the history of the Jews in the 20th century. I have to confess that I myself have never been to Baghdad, and everything I am about to tell you is either what I've heard or what I've read. So, up until about 75 years ago, Baghdad's population was between a fifth and a third Jewish. According to one statistic, Baghdad was 33% Jewish in 1939. At the time, it was proportionately more Jewish than Warsaw, which had 29%, and New York, which had 27% Jews. Today, there are just three known Jews in the entire country of Iraq. The writer Nissim Rizwan, whose book I have here, The Last Jews in Baghdad, he grew up in Baghdad as a young Jewish boy, and he described how Jews predominated in the market and commercial district. The Jews did not open their shops on the Sabbath and during Jewish holidays. The world outside the home was brought to a virtual standstill. The bazaars were practically empty, and all commercial activity in the city's main street virtually ceased. Not only did the Jews, who owned the overwhelming majority of shops and stores, close their businesses and refrain from doing any shopping themselves, non-Jews too followed suit, fearing that on Jewish holidays the owners of the few shops left open might overcharge them. Non-Jewish shop owners would also close for lack of customers. The Jews of Iraq were the oldest Jewish diaspora. They date back 2,600 years when the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar took the Jews as slaves from Jerusalem to Babylon. By the rivers of Babylon we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion, they wailed. The Persian king Cyrus permitted the Jews to return to Jerusalem 70 years later, but life was so good in Babylon that many Jews decided to stay on. As you know, the area was the birthplace of Judaism itself. The patriarch Abraham, who lived in Ur of the Chaldees, entered a covenant with the one God. A Jewish community was in continuous residence in the land known in Greek as Mesopotamia, that part of the Fertile Crescent called the land of the two rivers. The Jews of Babylon were mostly farmers, growing crops on the fertile land watered by the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. They also engaged in trade and commerce. For the local Jews, Ezra and Ezekiel were not just figures you read about in the Bible. They had a tangible and immediate presence. The Geonim, or wise men of the community, developed a Judaism that could survive in exile. It was centered on the synagogue instead of the temple in Jerusalem. Before the arrival of Islam, the Jews set up the yeshivot of Nehardea, Pumbedita, and Sura on the Euphrates River, south of Baghdad. They wrote the Babylonian Talmud, which to this day remains the most influential commentary on the Torah for Jews around the world. Empires came and went: Greeks, Romans, Seleucids, Sasanians. The Jews actually built the city of Baghdad, or comprised the majority of the inhabitants, after they were forced to leave Babylon. The the Persians had taken Babylon back from the Greeks and treated the Jews badly, accusing them of collaborating with the Greeks. The name Baghdad is composed of two Persian words, Bagh, which means garden, and Dad, which means city. So the name Baghdad or Baghdad means the city of gardens. The city was famous for its beauty, but periodically at the mercy of plagues and floods. In the 7th century, a new religion swept through the region, Islam. Iraq came under the rule of the Umayyads. They, in turn, were overthrown by the Abbasids in the 8th century, and the Umayyads re-established themselves in Spain. The Abbasid age in Baghdad was an age of intellectual brilliance, of scientists, astronomers, poets, mathematicians, musicians, historians, legalists, and philosophers. The Jews governed themselves under an exilarch. The exilarch was the leader of the Jewish community and was thought to be descended from the house of David. He was prominent both as a rabbinical authority and as a noble within the Persian and Arab court. The round city of Baghdad is the original core, built by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur in the 8th century as the official residence of the Abbasid court. Its official name in Abbasid times was City of Peace. And the Abbasid Caliph Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, who had sailed up and down the Tigris to find the best and most beautiful site on which to build his compound, actually built the round city. The round city must have been one of the wonders of the world. The royal precinct was at its heart. The very center was empty except for two fine buildings, the Great Mosque and the Caliph's Golden Gate Palace. The famous library, known as the House of Wisdom, was located within its grounds. And here you see a statue of the Caliph Mansur being retrieved after, I think, a bombing in Baghdad. This was obviously a few years ago. In 1168, Benjamin of Tudela visited Baghdad and found 40,000 Jews and 28 synagogues there. He wrote, "The great synagogue of the Exilarch has columns of marble of various colors overlaid with silver and gold, and on these columns are verses from the Psalms in gold letters. The city of Baghdad is 20 miles in circumference, situated in a land of palms, gardens, and plantations, the like of which cannot be found in the whole land of Babylon. People come thither with merchandise from all lands. Wise men live there, philosophers who know all manner of wisdom, and magicians expert in all manner of witchcraft." The Jews prospered under some Abbasid caliphs, but their situation deteriorated as tribes from Central Asia were brought in to defend the empire. 100 years after Benjamin of Tudela's visit, the Mongols invaded Iraq and destroyed the round city. They destroyed the synagogues and mosques. They massacred up to 2 million inhabitants. The streets ran red with blood. We know next to nothing about the Jews of that time. We don't know how Jews survived. It is possible that many of them fled north. What is certain is that many died or converted to Islam. But the community recovered. The center of Jewish life moved to the eastern bank of the river. The city was ruled by a succession of pashas or governors, Mamluks and Ottoman Turks. The 19th century saw the Sassoons extending their trade network eastwards to India and the Far East. And Jews actually migrated into Iraq from neighboring countries, from Syria, Kurdistan, and Persia. By the 20th century, Baghdad had about 50 synagogues. This is the Great Synagogue of Baghdad, also known as the Shad Veyativ Synagogue, one of the oldest synagogues in existence, with origins going back before recorded history. And its construction is attributed to King Jehoiakim, who led the Babylonian exile from Judea in 597 BCE. Unlike European synagogues, the Great Synagogue of Baghdad is built around a central open-air courtyard that allowed worshippers to enjoy a cool breeze during Baghdad's notoriously hot summers. And built out of natural materials like mud, it was renovated at least 4 times in its long history. And today you can see a reconstruction of it in Israel at the Babylonian Jewry Heritage Center in Or Yehuda, which is just outside Tel Aviv. The Jews of Iraq had intimate ties with their biblical history. No less than 6 biblical prophets had lived and died in the region, and one was the prophet Ezekiel, whose tomb was situated about 2 hours away from Baghdad, south at a place called Hilla. The Jews of Baghdad would go on pilgrimage to the tomb of Ezekiel, and this has now been transformed into a giant mosque. Baghdad itself was the site of the shrine of Joshua the high priest. He was the first high priest during the reconstruction of the Jewish temple after the return of the Jews from the Babylonian captivity. The Jews of Baghdad felt the need to venerate a more accessible tomb than that of Ezekiel. The site consisted of a burial chamber, a prayer hall, and a hostel. Since the tomb was located in a Muslim area, far from the Jewish quarter, a Muslim guard was hired by the Jews, and thus no permanent Jewish presence was needed. In 1889, a conflict erupted between the Jews and local Muslims during the funeral of the great Iraqi rabbi Abdallah Someh. The Turkish governor intervened, and the tomb was given to the Muslims on the pretext that it was a mosque and the burial site of the prophet Yusha, that's Joshua ben Nun, who's also mentioned in the Quran. It was 20 years later, in 1910, that the tomb was returned to the Jews. They held on to it until their exodus in the mid-20th century. There was a similar tug of war over the shrine of Ezekiel, and the Jews usually won control by appealing over the head of the local governor to the Sultan in Constantinople, to the Sultan, and paying hefty bribes. The tomb of Joshua the high priest has now become a mosque, and the Hebrew inscriptions you see on the ceiling there were painted over. There is another site venerated by Baghdad's Jews, the tomb of Sheikh Yitzhak Gaon. He was the Saraf, the 7th century chief treasurer of the Caliph Ali ben Abi. This tomb is in the old Jewish quarter of Rusafa on the eastern bank. The tomb was in Jewish hands until the Exodus, but since then it has become a ruin. After the Ottoman Turks who ruled Mesopotamia were defeated in World War I, Iraq became a British mandate. They installed King Faisal to rule Iraq. Although the British maintained control of the country's vast oil reserves, the British built bridges, roads, and infrastructure. King Faisal ruled for 13 years, and he is the bareheaded man with the beard in the front row of the picture. His reign was actually a golden age for the Jews, who under Ottoman law had been inferior dhimmis at the mercy of the local governors. The Jews moved out of the traditional Jewish quarters and even entered parliament. And sitting next to King Faisal in the picture is a man wearing a fez, and that is Sir Suson Heskel. More about him later. And the man sitting on the end, also wearing a fez, is Menachem Daniel, who was a Jewish senator. Also, I will talk about him later. Jews in Iraq enjoyed prosperity until the early 1940s. They were active in industry, in commerce, and government. Together, these accounted for 86% of Jewish occupations. Close to 75% of the importers, retailers, and wholesalers of imported goods were Jewish. Small businesses and internal trade were financed by the sarafim, that's the money lenders, most of whom were Jews. The Iraqi Bureau of Commerce had 2,430 registered members. 826 of them were Jews, and some were very wealthy. Most of the local merchants, about 5,000, were Jews. So as you can see, the Jewish quarter is actually on the eastern bank of the Tigris. You can see a sort of maze of alleyways and streets there. And one of them is Al-Rashid Street, which was the heart of the commercial and financial district. It was the first street in Baghdad to be paved. The colonnaded street also contained many government buildings and the copper, textile, and gold bazaars. And today it is famous for its bookstalls. South of Rashid Street is a commercial area with shops, cinemas, and business offices spread along Sardoun Street. More than half of Baghdad's 70 cinemas in the 1930s and 40s were owned by Jews. And this is the ornate Zahra cinema. There were both outdoor and indoor cinemas, frequented by both men and women. Most of the films shown were American. Jews were pioneers of modernity, the interface between Europe and the Middle East. As traders, they imported novelties from Europe, sewing machines, gramophones, X-ray machines, you name it. They also traded with India. In the early 1920s, when the British appointed the Emir Faisal to be the King of Iraq, there were no palaces fit for a king. Baghdad had ceased to be a capital for 400 years under the Ottoman Empire. Gertrude Bell, the British writer and diplomat, sailed a balam, or skiff, along the river Tigris in search of a suitable residence. King Faisal inspected several Jewish-owned riverside villas. Faisal's first choice for a royal residence was Qasr Shashua, a large castle built on the banks of the river Tigris. It was rented from the owner, Shaul Shashua, a wealthy Jewish tea merchant, for 2 years or more until a new palace could be built for the king. And Qasr Shashua became a byword for a mansion in everyday language. A woman was once being interviewed on an Iraqi TV talk show. "I'm so tired," she complained, "cleaning my house all day long." "What do you think you're doing?" the talk show host retorted. "Cleaning Qasr Shashua? You only have 2 small rooms." The banks of the river Tigris were prone to frequent flooding, and water eroded the Qasr. Eventually, part of the building crumbled into the river. A Jewish girl who remembers spending her childhood in the house recalls that when part of the house fell in the water, the front door was so huge that it got stuck under one of Baghdad's bridges. A huge key, more than a foot long, was still in the keyhole. This is Senator Menahem Daniel's house. He had been a deputy in the Ottoman Chamber of Deputies in Istanbul and represented Jews in the Iraqi parliament between 1920 and 1932. His son Ezra Menahem Daniel succeeded him as a senator. Menahem Daniel's house is typical of many constructed by the wealthy Iraqi Jewish community in the early 20s. It is in a sorry state now, but the 2-story house built for the family in 1919 had marble staircases. It was tiled with floral and geometric designs, latticed windows, and sprawling inner courtyards. And it had a view of the Tigris River. A wing for guests overlooks Al Rashid Street. Daniel installed what was thought to be the first elevator or lift in Iraq so that his wife could find it easier to access the roof. King Faisal was thought to have stayed in the house. Also on Rashid Street is Sir Son Heskel's House of Dreams. Sir Son Heskel, who you see in his official uniform, was Iraq's Jewish finance minister, and he served 5 terms in government during the 1920s. He is credited with tying Iraq's oil revenues to the gold standard rather than sterling. This was a stroke of genius when sterling plummeted in value. He never filled his large mansion with children, as he remained a bachelor all his life. The House of Dreams was by all accounts a magnificent and elegant building with its graceful curves, its arches and balustrades. His great niece remembers it as a palace overlooking the river Tigris, many bedrooms all around the balconies and sweeping staircases on both sides. She told me, "We always had all the festivals there, Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot, when they built this beautiful sukkah and made it look like a lounge. There were big areas for all of us to play hide and seek. The main drawing room was so large, with wonderful chandeliers and a grand piano. The House of Dreams became a telephone exchange, a theatre, army barracks, and currently it houses the offices of the Iraqi Independent Film Center. At one point, it was rumored that the house had been demolished by a property developer, but it turns out that this was another of Sasson Heskel's properties, not the House of Dreams. In the 30s and 40s, many middle-class Jews started to move to the more modern neighborhoods in the south of Baghdad. The Jewish house in Baghdad was built in the old-fashioned Oriental style, usually composed of 2 floors with a large open courtyard in the middle. The cook and the maids lived on the ground floor by the kitchen. The sleeping quarters were on the 2nd floor, overlooking the courtyard. The residents enjoyed sleeping on the roof on hot summer nights. Families and relatives lived in the same neighborhood, and in some cases, the adult sons and their spouses stayed with parents even after they married and had children. And each couple had 1 or 2 rooms in the big house and all shared the same kitchen. Most of these families lived in harmony, or at least tolerated each other. And some of the Jewish homes were above the shops of the market. They were distinguished by their shnashil verandas with large windows that jutted out over the street. And these rooms were designed to improve ventilation and provide relief from the heat. The shnashil often had intricate wooden lattice work. And here you see a whole street of Jewish homes abandoned by their owners when they joined the Exodus in 1950. Batawin was a predominantly Jewish middle-class district of Baghdad, built in the 1930s and overlooking the river Tigris. It was known for its beautiful houses and vibrant community life. And this house belonged to my maternal grandparents and backed on to Abu Nawas Street on the riverfront. My mother and her siblings played in an idyllic large garden containing all manner of fruit trees and even some animals. Parallel to Sardoun Street, Abu Nawas Street on the riverfront was once the city showpiece. The well-heeled, sorry, just go back again. The well-heeled residents would stroll along the river promenade and watch the Bedouins plant zucchini, fava beans, and cucumbers at low tide. Baghdadis would sit in the cafes, blaring the songs of the great Egyptian diva Kulthum. During the 1990s, the street lost much of its old glamour, and its cafes, restaurants, and luxury hotels either closed or became down at heel. The Jews have long gone, their gardens built over, and alcoholics and prostitutes have moved in. And the neighborhood featured several synagogues, including the Meir Tweg synagogue, and this is the only surviving synagogue in Baghdad, and it is almost permanently closed. Al-Batawin was home to prestigious Jewish schools like the Frank Ini and Shamash schools, which provided high-quality education. A short walk away was the Alliance School. This was one of a network of schools founded as the Alliance Israélite Universelle by French Jews in the late 19th century. It transformed the Jewish community by giving them a Western education, languages, maths, science, all the skills they needed to prosper in the modern world. For the first time, girls were educated too. Here is the Laura Kaduri School for Girls, named after the wife of the famous businessman and philanthropist Eli Kaduri, who made his money in the Far East. Girls were taught dressmaking and needlework, as well as to read and write. And here is a nice picture, I think dating back to the 1920s, perhaps, or even earlier. Now, there was a school for the blind founded in 1929, also named after Eli Kaduri. It taught music mostly to blind Jews, although there were non-Jews too, who would otherwise be left to beg on the streets. It gave them a means of earning an income. The blind musicians would become the mainstay of the orchestras and ensembles in Iraq, which were almost all composed of Jews. During the 1930s, two brothers began to gain popularity in Iraq, the Al-Kuwaiti brothers, musicians, Salah, a violin player, and Daoud, an oud player. Salah is standing at the back holding his violin, and Daoud, I think, has got an oud in his hand, sitting in the front. They became extremely famous, the Simon and Garfunkel of Iraq. At the same time, a Jewish singer called Salima Murad became famous and seems to have bewitched all the men. The Prime Minister himself bestowed the honorific title Pasha on her, so she became known as Salima Pasha. And the brothers Saleh and Daoud al-Kuwaiti composed new songs for Salima. Following the opening of the Iraqi broadcast radio station in 1936, Saleh was asked to form the official music ensemble for the radio station, and he introduced two instruments, the cello and the ney. Baghdadis spent their leisure in the coffee houses of the city, and some cafes were frequented by intellectuals and artists. Others had cabarets and employed dancers, singers, and musicians. There were also bars, nightclubs, and brothels. And on the right, you see a backgammon game in progress. Backgammon known as tawli in Arabic. In one of those cafes, you might have heard Salima Murad perform. While the Al-Kuwaiti brothers moved to Israel in 1950, Salima Murad chose to stay behind in Iraq, and she converted to Islam. The river was the beating heart of Baghdad. It was the main artery for transporting goods up to Mosul in the north and down to the Arabian Gulf in the south. Little islands would emerge from the river in summer, and the Jews enjoyed picnicking there. And this was a traditional vessel that you saw on the Tigris. It's sort of round kufa. For leisure, the Jews loved to take boat rides on the Tigris River. They would stop at the little islands where there was served freshly caught, butterflied and charcoal grilled carp. Here's another picture of a kufa on the Tigris. And this was samak musguf. Even today, Iraqi Jews go weak at the knees at the thought of this delicious dish. And many Jews recall learning to swim in the Tigris. Even Jewish girls learnt to swim, although some had to answer to boys' names in the water, in case they attracted the attention of passing Arabs. This is Baghdad's famous department store, Orozdi Bak. This was one of a chain of department stores spread across the Middle East and the Levant. It was founded by a Hungarian Jewish family. The Baghdad building was rather nondescript compared to its more ornate counterparts in Cairo, Smyrna, Beirut, or Tunis. Food shopping was done exclusively by the men in markets where very often both the vendors and the customers were Jews, and they would buy fresh food in the mornings, carrying it in wicker baskets, meat, vegetables, eggs, bread, and whatever food was needed every day. And by the time they got home, the wife had prepared breakfast. The main Jewish cemetery was designated as a place of burial for Jews by the Ottoman Sultan Murad IV around 1639. At least Baghdad had a cemetery. Jews in the northern city of Mosul, for instance, had to bury their dead in their basements. In a story befitting the Arabian Nights, legend has it that a poor Jewish woman was granted the Jewish cemetery after she had shared her bread with the Sultan, who was planning to conquer Baghdad from the Safavid Persians. On the eve of his army's attack, the Sultan entered Baghdad on foot, disguised as a poor dervish, and knocked on her door. The woman opened her door and said she was ready to share her own pita bread with him, and she gave him half. The Sultan went back to his camp with the half pita in his hand. He told his soldiers, "This is a sign that God is with us, and we shall attack Baghdad the following morning and capture the city." By midday, he had expelled the Persians. He became the ruler of Baghdad. Some historians say that nearly 2,000 Jewish men supported him. He asked his men to fetch that poor woman who was generous enough to give him half a pita. He handed her 2 bags full of gold and silver coins, and he said, "This is my gift to you. Now make a wish." The woman answered that she did not want anything for herself, but requested that he earmark a piece of land as a cemetery for the Jewish community. And he agreed. And this cemetery was the main Jewish cemetery from that time, that's the 17th century, until 1958, when the Iraqi government decided to destroy it. And today it is a bus garage. So this is the new cemetery that was built after 1958. About 4,000 graves were exhumed from the old cemetery and transferred to the new cemetery. And this is what happened to the old cemetery. Now it's a bus garage. We now come to a seminal event in the history of the Jews of Iraq in the 20th century, the Farhud. This is the name of the massacre which took place over 2 days in June 1941. It was Shavuot. And the Farhud, which actually means forced dispossession in Arabic, began when a crowd of rioters intent on looting and murder began attacking Jews on the Al-Khor bridge. Jews were ordered to get out of the minibuses in which they were traveling to visit their families, and a number of them were murdered. The violence spread to the narrow alleyways on the eastern bank of the river, Al-Rusafa, and neighboring districts heavily populated by the great mass of poor and lower middle-class Jews, such as Shorja, Tatran, Abu Sifain, and Bab el-Sharq. They were worst hit. Salim Fatal was 11 when he witnessed the Farhud from his home in Tatran, the heart of the Jewish quarter. In his memoir, he wrote, "The Jews of Tatran and the nearby district passed a long, slow night of dread. From inside our house, we could hear screams from nearby homes. I will never forget those agonized cries which still echo in my ears today. Helpless Jews had been cornered in their homes and fallen prey to robbers, murderers, and rapists who abused their victims to their heart's content with no let or hindrance. They slit throats, slashed off limbs, smashed skulls. They made no distinction between women, children, and old people. To escape the rioters, many Jews climbed up to the roofs of their homes. As you can see from this photograph, the houses were so close together that the residents could escape the marauders by leaping from roof to roof. The final official toll was 179 dead, Jews dead, 3,000 homes looted, 14,000 left homeless. The dead were actually buried in this loaf-shaped mass grave, which was destroyed along with the old cemetery in 1958. The Farhud sounded the death knell for the community. And within 10 years, almost the entire community had fled to Israel. The exodus occurred after Iraq had joined the war against the new state of Israel. And during a single year, Jews were allowed to leave legally on condition that they forfeited their citizenship. In March 1951, that's a year later, the Iraqi parliament passed a law dispossessing the Jews of their property. While matters improved in the late 1950s after Iraq rid itself of its king in a bloody revolution, the 6,000 or so Jews who remained in the country were issued with yellow identity cards and prevented from leaving the country. And this is Tahrir Square. On the 27th of January 1969, Jews were horrified to witness the spectacle of 9 Jews being executed here on trumped-up spying charges, and 500,000 Iraqis came to picnic, sing, and dance under the gallows. In 2023, the Americans 2003, not 2023, 2003, the Americans invaded Baghdad and found some 30 Jews living in the city. Today, only 3 known Jews live in the entire country. If you were to visit Baghdad yourself, and not just virtually, I'm afraid you will find little trace left of the Jewish presence, which goes back 2,600 years. Homes have been abandoned or taken over. Synagogues have been turned into sports clubs, supermarkets, or mosques. The Iraqi Jews' descendants are now in Israel, where they have made their mark. Iraq has never acknowledged causing their exodus, nor given compensation. Iraq is still technically at war with Israel, and much Jewish property has been stolen. There is no prospect of any Abraham Accords with Iraq, sadly. In fact, we seem to be going backwards. In 2022, Iraq, which has come under Iranian influence, passed a law criminalizing normalization between Iraq and Israel. So on that rather sad note, I will stop there. Very happy to answer any questions. So I just need to click on there. Oh, right. Shelley, what was life like for Jewish women in Baghdad in the 20th century? What was their education like? Did they work outside the home? At what age did they marry? Lots of questions there. As I said, they weren't really allowed out of the house. I mean, they didn't even do the shopping, the food shopping. That was left to the men. However, they were educated. The Alliance Israélite was set up in the late 19th century, and for the first time, girls were actually taught to read and write. They didn't always stay to to the end of their education. Sometimes they were taken out of school early to get married. So that was really a disadvantage, obviously. In the 1930s and 1940s, you do hear of women actually going out to work, and you hear of women who are quite highly qualified, like they became chemists or pharmacists, and some even doctors. At what age did they marry? Yes, as I say, it was a problem that they were taken out of school at the age of 12 or 13 and married off, some of them. Thank you, Rita, for the link. Sally, my father was born in Baghdad in 1890 and went to the Alliance School. He left at 17 to work in Bombay. Yes, of course, there was this Sassoon trading network in India and in the Far East, and a lot of Jews went to work for the Sassoons in the Sassoon businesses. The Alliance Israélite actually was a fantastic school. It taught several languages, a very, very high standard of education. And Sally says, my father used to talk about swimming in the Tigris. Barbara, thank you for your kind words. Why did the government turn on the Jews? That is a vast question, Peter, which I don't really have time to go into, but I would say that conditions started deteriorating in the 1930s. There was a great deal of Nazi influence. Iraq was also the center of Arab nationalism, and therefore Jews were not considered to be, part of the new Iraq. and they were gradually marginalized and ultimately forced out. And thank you, Rita. How many Jews were forced out of Baghdad in the 1950s? Well, the official figure for those who were airlifted to Israel is 105,000. But before that, Jews had been leaving illegally. So there were several, tens of thousands who left at that time. Almost the entire community had left by 1951. That's all except for about 6,000 Jews, and those Jews remained in the 60s, and then many of them were smuggled out of the country because they were not allowed to leave legally. And you hear of hair-raising tales of how they left in the middle of the night through the Kurdish mountains. It's sort of quite a saga. Diane, was there not an attempt after the Gulf Wars to try and persuade Jews to return to Iraq, presumably to help put the country back on its feet financially? Well, it was back in the 70s, actually, that several Arab countries asked for the Jews to go back to the country. And I think a couple of Iraqi Jews did actually try and go back. And I don't know what happened to them. I don't think they came to a very good end. But of course, you'd have to be mad to go back to Iraq when it was run by dictatorial regimes that were busy slaughtering their own people. Barbara says, was anti-Semitism felt in the good early times? That's an interesting question, because when you ask Jews what it was like, they say, oh, it was wonderful, it was a golden age. But the 20s were also a time of rising nationalism. And for instance, Sir Sasson Heskel, who was the Jewish finance minister, he was frequently attacked in the press and by nationalists. So there was anti-Semitism even in the good times. What happened to the Jews that were not allowed to leave? Well, I can tell you that they were trapped. I know I've told this story before. I had an aunt who actually had resettled in London, and she went back to Iraq in the 1960s to sell some property, leaving her children behind in London. And she wasn't allowed to leave for 6 years, and eventually she was smuggled out through Kurdistan. And reunited with her family. Were Iraqi Jews involved in the opium trade? Not in Iraq. You're thinking about the Sassoons who were involved in the opium trade, at least initially, and made an awful lot of money out of it. Shelley, were the Iraqi Jews as shocked as the German Jews under the Nazis were by the massacres? You mean, were the Iraqi Jews as shocked by the Farhud? Well, yes, I mean, it affected them quite badly, especially the Jews who lived in the traditional Jewish quarter. It was a terrible shock. And it was actually the main reason, I would say, why the Jewish community decided to leave when they had the opportunity in 1950. There was an airlift to Israel. And so 90% of the community took advantage of that opportunity to leave. Yes, Kings of Shanghai, Ruth Friedman. I shall be talking about the Kaduris actually in my next lecture, which I think is on the 10th of April, if anyone's interested. The Sassoon family actually gave a lecture about them in China on the 16th of January, if anyone wants to catch up with that. The Sassoon family were into heroin, important. I don't know about heroin, but definitely opium. They made their money out of opium. Did your parents join you in England? Well, I wasn't born then. My parents actually moved to England in 1950, and I was born in England. And did they adapt to life in the West? Yes, they did. I would say, I mean, my parents were both educated at the Alliance, so they could actually speak English, which was a great advantage. And they managed to rebuild their lives, although they were always, I mean, socially, they tended to mix with other Iraqi Jews. And thank you, Adi. Lawrence, what was the thinking behind not letting the remaining Jews leave after the main exodus? Well, the Jews were really hostages to the Arab-Israeli conflict, I would say, and there were certain restrictions imposed on them. They were made to carry yellow identity cards. They were restricted in their movements. They were not allowed to venture more than a few kilometers outside Baghdad. Yeah, Lynette, thank you. And Carmela Rajwan, I attended the Alliance School. It was great to see the picture of the school. Great. I'm glad you appreciated that. Rhonda, thank you. Thank you. Moshe Gruber, wonderful books published in Israel about life in Iraq by Sami Michael and Eli Amir. Yeah, absolutely. And Carol says, I have many friends who ran away from Baghdad. One son married a daughter of a good friend. They have a bridge club in Golders Green in London. Yes, they love playing bridge. And they love clubs, basically, which is something they had in Baghdad. I forgot to mention that there was actually a Laura Kaduri club in Baghdad. They're very friendly. Oh, nice to know that. And they love entertaining and cooking. Thank you, Carol. How did they make it in Israel, says iPad? Well, of course, it was very difficult at first because Israel put them in tent camps when they first arrived because it didn't have the housing for them. And it was very tough, but many of them soon moved out of the Marbarot, the tent camps, and today they're one of the most successful communities in Israel. They're the third largest community in Israel after the ex-Soviet and the Moroccan Jews. And they often are to be found in banks, as bank managers, as accountants, even lawyers. Very successful community. Sydney Sassoon came to Johannesburg from Baghdad. Nice to know. Lorna, thank you. Daniela, thank you. You're in Zurich. Very international. And we enjoyed wonderfully different Pesach in the Sassoon home. Yes, we have our own traditions at Pesach, slightly different from what you might be used to. So I think is that the end?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, well, thank you very much. And talking of Pesach, I wish you all Chag Sameach. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Lynn, and good afternoon and good evening to you all.